Well, welcome everybody to the Connecticut Mirror's 2026 Budget Review with State Budget Reporter Keith Phaneuf. I'm John Dankosky. Thanks so much for joining us on this Wednesday evening. I want to first thank the generous financial supporters of Connecticut Mirror's event series, our presenting sponsor, Eversource, amplifying sponsors CBIA and Mohegan Tribe, publishing sponsors CLA, Express Strategies, Hinkley Allen, Rowthorn Law LLC, the Causeway Agency. Of course, if you follow along with all of Keith's reporting and the other great reporting that you get at Connecticut Mirror, I'm sure that you often go to ctmirror.org. If you do go to that website, please feel free to click that box in the upper right-hand corner and make a donation to support it. Since the last time we talked, just a couple of weeks ago when we did our start of the legislative session preview with Mark Phaneuf, some big news came down about the Washington Post, one of the greatest newspapers in the history of America, and some massive cuts that are happening there. I think it's incredibly important as you think about the future of journalism to just remember how important new news sources, relatively new, like the Connecticut Mirror are. We've been around for a while, but not as long as the Washington Post. We would like to ask you to support the work that we're doing so that we can continue on covering the state budget and covering the state capitol. It's ctmirror.org and just click donate. Okay, before we get started, if you've got questions for Keith, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many of these as we possibly can. If we don't get to your question, Keith, you always make a really nice offer for people, and you'll answer their questions, right?
I'll be happy to. I included my email address in the chat. That's not to send your questions tonight. Like John said, those go in the Q&A. But if right after we log off, you think of one, shoot, you forgot to ask, send me an email and I will do my best to answer it. I will get back to you no matter what, and I'll do my best to answer it.
Thank you so much, Keith. I think everyone really appreciates that. And I guess I should ask you just off the start, you've covered a lot of these budgets so far. What exactly is the big takeaway from the budget that the governor put out? And what are you thinking about as we head through this legislative session?
Well, I think about the budget all the time, and that's, yes, a little sad. But what I would take from this one, honestly, I know the governor's rebate got the headlines, but I think of what it really reflects, which is Connecticut's budget caps that supporters call the fiscal guardrails. Despite the successes they've had in driving down our pension debt, are really sort of crowding out other things. People are, from supporters of these guardrails to opponents, are really struggling to work with them. The rebate that the governor offered actually has to compromise with the guardrails or it won't work. We've started to see in recent years, we wanted to open a program to expand childcare slots. We had to go outside the guardrails to make it work. We're going through a period of change where Connecticut is starting to say, did it overcompensate in its savings habits for all those decades from the 30s through the 2010, where it didn't save? We're really in a period of change, transition.
Okay, so this big period of transition, as you say, the headline is these rebates that the governor has put forward. Maybe we can talk about those for just a second before we get into the details of some of the things that aren't being funded. But talk about what is in these rebates exactly.
Well, it's going to be $500 million. Technically, it's sales tax revenues. Well, we have about $5.3 billion in sales tax revenues that support the budget's general fund. The overall budget's $28.6 billion as the governor's proposed it. The sales tax supports, again, roughly about 1/5 to 1/6 of that. But you can't take $500 million out and not create a huge problem. So what the governor is going to do is he's going to take the $500 million from the sales tax, but then replenish the money with $500 million from this fiscal year's surplus, brought to you courtesy of the guardrails. So then, and by the way, what's the big deal about why it has to be a sales tax rebate? We learned a lesson back in 1998. Governor Rowland and the General Assembly gave a rebate. I believe it was like $100, $50 a person, $100 for a couple. And you have to define what revenue stream you're taking it from. So they picked the income tax, the largest one. And then we found out state income tax rebates are subject to federal income taxation. So everybody got a rebate in 1998 and had to give 25 to 30% of it to Washington. Connecticut has never done an income tax rebate since. But that's just a little bit of trivia aside. The more important thing is this is a $200 per person rebate that Governor Lamont has proposed. It would go out in October, by the way, and that's going to get him some criticism. He's running for re-election, and I don't think the timing is an accident. If you are a single person making $200,000 or less, you'd be eligible for the $200. If you're a married couple making less than $400,000, you'd be eligible for $400, or still $200 per person. Those are the basic nuts and bolts.
So if we're just talking about this in raw numbers, I remember this roll-in rebate that you were talking about from the Wayback Machine. At the time, it kind of felt like, well, not that terribly much money, $100 over, for people who are struggling through this year over the course of an entire year. And that was in what year is that, Keith? 2000,
1998.
$1998. Okay, so twice that doesn't seem like a huge amount of money. I've certainly had people making comments on social media saying the governor seems to think that this is going to pay for my heating bill, but ain't going to pay for even like a quarter of my heating and electricity bill. So I guess I'm wondering a little bit about what that's really going to do for people.
Well, that's where he's going to get a lot of pushback from both sides of the aisle because a rebate, and I'm sorry, I should have said this up front, it's one time. It's not an ongoing program. So you're just getting, as John said, $200 or $400 if you're a couple once. Many of the governor's fellow Democrats in the majority favor a child tax credit, which would give low and middle income families $600 per child, up to $1,800 for one household year after year. Now, they might have to phase it in, but they're looking for ongoing relief. House Republicans want to add as much as $700 to the property tax credit. It's an income tax credit that covers a portion of your local property tax bill. That would also cost about $500 million, excuse me. I wish it only cost $500,000, $500 million. And that will go millions, billions. We'll just swap them in and out. That would also go on. And then we just saw this week, the Senate Republicans put out a very controversial proposal to cut income tax rates and provide a new income tax credit that would effectively wipe out the municipal tax on motor vehicles, non-commercial motor vehicles. And we're talking about giving $1.5 billion a year back to taxpayers. Ironically, you could not do that without basically gutting almost all of the savings effort that we have going on right now to pay down our pension debt. I don't expect that proposal is going to go very far in that form. But all the other proposals are ongoing. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So in many ways, the Republicans who have been preaching fiscal discipline, the type of fiscal discipline that Lamont has provided with these fiscal guardrails over the course of the last couple of years, they're saying, well, look, if you're going to take the guardrails away to give a $200 rebate to people in October when you're going for re-election, why don't we have an ongoing $1.5 billion rebate? It's coming from the same place, isn't it? And I don't know, Keith, do they have a point?
I understand what they're saying. They're saying that it's open season on the guardrails. I don't know, though, if even the House Republicans agree with the Senate Republicans. And certainly I don't think, I think most legislators are not ready to. In fairness to the Senate Republicans, their argument is, in their opinion, Governor Lamont's rebate program is an obvious attempt to pick up votes with a one-time expenditure from the same surpluses that he blocked advocates for social services from touching, that he blocked advocates for municipal aid from touching, that he blocked advocates for healthcare for touching, saying, I understand you want to spend these dollars, but Connecticut has enormous pension debt, a legacy debt left to us by 3 generations. We have to focus on paying that down as fast as possible. And now he's carved out a major exception for himself, saying, I'm only going to do it one time. And I think the Senate Republican argument is we think that's pretty obvious that it's an effort to pump up his reelection chances. We feel that we're entitled to say if it's open season, let's just dismantle this whole thing and give all the money back to the taxpayers.
Well, and I think there's another question. It's just about the ongoing nature of it, right? As opposed to a one-time payment during an election year, because of the tax receipts that have been coming in over the course of the last couple of years, and it's something you and I have talked about for several years now about whether or not these fiscal guardrails were tuned exactly right, given the amount of money that is coming in from taxes. Does it see whether or not the numbers of 1.5 billion, Keith, or 500 million on an ongoing basis? Is there an argument that there's some sort of ongoing tax relief that could be found in this budget if we indeed decide as a state that's how we want to spend the money? I mean, could they do that year on end?
That is a different matter. Absolutely. I mean, just as people have said, the budget caps are prioritizing pension debt too much. They're an overcorrection from generations of saving too little to now saving excessively and trying to have one generation solve a problem created by three at the expense of that one generation's college education, K-12 education, access to healthcare, access to social services, and so on. I think some folks are saying we also have an opportunity to at least ease somewhat the cost of living in Connecticut. Because you raise a good point, John. State taxes, and I'm not trying to downplay them, they don't quite, state tax increases and state tax cuts sometimes don't hit quite as hard as the political rhetoric makes it seem. You know, the big state tax cuts returned like $300, and the big increases don't seem to take that much more. But that said, we are in a situation where Connecticut stands to lose a lot of money unless Washington reverses itself, a lot of federal aid. And not all of that is even being taken away from Connecticut state government, some from Connecticut families. There's certainly an argument that could be made that Connecticut families could use $300, $400, $500. Oh, and again, we've seen with the child tax credit, some folks are ready to say they give them an extra $1,800 a year. The child tax credit would cost $300 to $400 million a year. But that's still, I mean, we're expecting to finish this fiscal year with $1.9 billion unspent. So I'm sorry to throw a lot of numbers at folks, but that's less than a quarter of the surplus. And we've been averaging surpluses of about 1.8 billion since 2017. I should mention one other thing. I hate to almost call them surpluses because that implies they're dollars that are just lying around that we didn't need. These are forced surpluses, as in we're making a conscious decision to take money away. If I were to take money away if I were running your household spending for you, John, and I was going to try to bump up your savings account, but I was going to do it by shortchanging the bank on your mortgage, and we weren't going to make your full car payment, and we weren't going to pay your utility bills, your savings account would go up and up, but you'd be having a lot of problems very soon. To a certain extent, Connecticut's been bumping up its savings, not by failing to meet all of its most immediate obligations, but by cutting back in a lot of areas.
Okay, so you and I have been using these metaphors for years and years. Let me challenge your metaphor briefly here, Keith. Because
Sure.
I want to think about it. If you're talking about that in terms of, say, my household budget, I think actually what you're talking about is something that's more like I have a very high credit card debt and I need to pay it off. And you're going to raid every other fund that I have, including my other savings accounts, and you're going to use it just to pay off that credit card. It's not necessarily about a savings here because I've got this credit card debt, and that is what that pension debt, isn't it? It's like owing 21.5% to Capital One. Like I got to pay that off, and if I take it from someplace else, maybe that makes more sense.
Well, one, I like that analogy. It's spot on. Two,
you can use it.
I was going to say I may steal that, but if I can just build on your analogy, that credit card debt really wasn't yours. It was from your parents, your grandparents, and your great grandparents,
Fair.
and you were hoping that you could whittle it down and that maybe a couple subsequent generations could help with it. And it's like, no, you've kind of come up with a scheme of you will deal with the whole burden. And that's why we're not going to necessarily cover your full mortgage. We're not going to cover your full car payment. We're not going to cover your utilities. We're going to cut your household grocery budget down to $50 a week. Get used to buying bologna and Kool-Aid. And then people say, well, there's all this money in the savings account. Well, it's got another purpose. The problem is for years, Governor Lamont has said, let's not touch that. Let's really go after that pension debt. And that's understandable. That's a valuable thing to pay off pension debt. But now that he's carved out this new exception, I think it could be not just Senate Republicans who are saying it's open season on the guardrails.
We actually have a couple questions coming in from folks, and if you have questions for Keith, just put them in the Q&A at the bottom. A couple of these are really just level setting what we're talking about right now. John is asking how much of unfunded pension liabilities and other obligations are still to be funded. How much has already been met? And then our friend Fred, hi Fred, says, can you summarize the progress on reducing the state's debt? So where are we right now?
Sure. Right now, we owe about $33.5 billion. That's what we still owed entering this fiscal year just on pension debt. Please keep in mind that does not cover what we call bonded debt. There are tens of billions more that understandably we carry. We borrow money when we build roads and bridges, rail lines, when we construct local schools. We give towns a lot of the money to pay for that. Capital projects of public colleges and universities. If you preserve farmland or open space, all of that goes on the state's credit card. And then there's a third big area of debt. That's state employee retirement health care. In some ways, it's not the largest, but it's the most egregious because Connecticut still does not cover that full burden. In other words, when you hire an employee, in theory, if you want to provide a retirement benefit, you're socking away money all the time this employee's on the job over decades. So when he or she retires, the money's there to cover the benefit. In fact, by socking it away while they're working, you can invest the money, and not all of it has to come from the government or the taxpayer. Some of it can come from the interest earnings. But we still don't set aside the full amount needed every year. In other words, we're mailing a bill to our children and our grandchildren saying you will cover part of the cost of the retirement health care for the public employees who serve us today. There's that burden out there as well. And Connecticut will be paying on that pension debt probably at the pace we're projected at now until the mid-2040s. So for folks who say, well, I don't mind piling it all on one generation and saying, you take the hit, because this will be over in what, 2-3 more years? No, we're probably talking 2 more decades.
We have a bunch of people with questions. That you have all these fans who like ask very specific Keith questions. So let's just
I don't
go to
like call them fans, but they can still ask the questions.
No, they're fans. Suzanne says, what about interest payments on the debt? Doesn't paying it off give us more money to spend? And honestly, when we were talking about our household income, right? If you get rid of the big debt that you're paying all this interest on, it does benefit you down the road.
There absolutely is a benefit to that. The problem with that is it is always presented out of perspective. When you look at all the extra money we've put in the pensions, we're required every single year to put aside about $3.5 billion into the pension fund. So roughly, again, maybe 1/8 to 1/9 of the entire budget goes to those required payments. Those payments serve 2 purposes. They set aside money for present day workers, so at least we're not making the problem worse. And they also chip away at the legacy debt. Believe it or not, our required payments. 3/4 of those required payments chip away at that legacy debt. But then what we're also doing is, if we have money left over, ever since 2020, we've been putting that into the pensions. And it's like making a secondary payment. And that just really drives down the debt. Because of all those secondary payments, and I want to phrase this correctly, our pension contribution, our required payments will be something like $850 million less than they otherwise would have been. That's not the same as saying they went down 850 million year over year. Actually, like last year, our pension contributions still went up year over year. It just would have been like $700 million more painful. So the problem is when folks say, well, doesn't that give you more money to spend? We're not spending that money. The state is
Mm,
scooping up all that savings. That savings is not going into healthcare or municipal aid or education. All we're saying to them is, I know you feel like you're starving, but we were about to disembowel you. At least we didn't do that. Sorry, I knew I was going to get into a disemboweling verb at some point in this talk. That's what we did. So if you're saying there's not that savings, keep in mind the other alternative is you don't have to save at quite this feverish pace and still deal with a problem created over 70 years in a more gradual fashion.
mm.
That's the difference.
Nan is asking a question. How does Connecticut fare right now compared to other states regarding debt? Because I know years ago, I mean, we were really at the bottom or the top of the heap, depending on which end of the heap you were looking at. How are we doing right now compared to our neighbors?
We are still, if you look at the numbers with the Pew Charitable Trusts, we are still in the bottom half of states. One thing that's different is we're paying it off faster than other states. The trade-off is more and more people are coming to the conclusion that's not necessarily a good thing. Let me give you an exaggerated example. If you created a problem over 70 years and you told the Connecticut General Assembly you have 1 year to solve it, 1 year, you could shut down all of government. You could just take money out of everything and you wouldn't be able to solve it. And they'd be taking our money, presumably buying Powerball tickets, hoping that they hit it big. The key is how much of a delay is acceptable? How much is too fast? How much is too slow? And Connecticut tends to just try an approach without really thinking it through and then seeing how that works. And then they react. And like I said, we're going through a reaction now where you have the Republican Party saying, well, the Senate Republican caucus saying, since it's open season on the guardrails, let's give it all back to the taxpayers. The truth of the matter is they could give more back on an ongoing basis than the governor is by simply cutting their plan in half and still leave a sizable amount for pension debt. There's a little bit of election year politics in everybody's proposal.
Well, so let's go to the other side. We've talked a little bit about the Senate and the House Republicans and some of their plans, and maybe it's open season because the governor wants to give this rebate during an election year. On the other side, you've talked a little bit about this, but the state not adequately, for instance, funding Medicaid. I mean, what exactly does that mean for the state when we don't put the dollars that we have available towards solving that problem? What sort of impact are we seeing in the state right now, Keith?
Okay, let's go back to your analogy, John. You talked about what if I have a big credit card debt that I have to pay off and I've got to pay that, so I'm going to shortchange other areas. The problem is we have certain areas, just like we talked about, well, we're not going to pay the bank. The truth is, if you don't pay your mortgage, the bank's going to take your house. Okay. So there's only a few places in the state budget where we really kind of drop the hammer and put things on cruise on a freeze frame. We're seeing, for example, social services and municipal aid because we have the legal flexibility to tighten the reins on them. They haven't been keeping pace with inflation for, in some cases, decades. So, for example, we have the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities saying that when it comes just to education aid, cities and towns are really down about $400 million a year when you adjust for inflation. The community-based nonprofits that deliver the overwhelming bulk of our services to people with developmental and intellectual disabilities, people struggling with mental illness or addiction, reentry programs for people getting out of the correction system. They're also losing hundreds of millions of dollars because their payments haven't stagnated. That's the area that we are cutting back again and again and again.
We've got more questions coming in. We'll get to some of them in just a minute. Again, Q&A at the bottom of the screen if you have questions for Keith. One last sort of just basic budgeting question. We got this from Ellison, who was writing in from Avon. Could you explain why the state doesn't use zero-based budgeting rather than incremental-based budgeting, which assumes that every dollar spent is well spent? So first of all, explain zero-based budgeting, Keith.
Sure. Zero-based budgeting in a nutshell is just because I spent $10 on a program last year, this year I'm not going to assume that I've got to spend at least 10 or 10 plus inflation or even any dollars. I'm going to assume nothing. And each year I start each program fresh and I reevaluate it. Unfortunately, I don't even know if that works entirely in business, but in the state, you can't do it. For example, the people who bought the bonds that financed our transportation construction, our school construction, they expect to get paid. It's not negotiable. If we don't pay them, they'll go to a federal judge and will be ordered to pay them. You have contracts with state employees. You've committed to a pension. You can't not make those contributions. The Medicaid system that somebody talked about, and I'm sorry, I didn't fully answer the Medicaid question. That's an entitlement program. So when you agree with Washington to participate and you establish what are the parameters, you have to meet those parameters, as in you have to serve everybody who is income eligible. You can't say, well, we're just deciding not to. And you can't just pull yourself out of the Medicaid program overnight. You'd have to work with Washington. There are too many things that you are absolutely committed to. And then just lastly, there are things that are politically not realistic. If you said, well, we spend close to $3 billion on grants to cities and towns, let's just assume zero-based budgeting. The cities and towns are going to turn around and say, well, we do have a property tax. We're going to collect that money one way or the other. There would be no one from either party who would vote for that.
Real quick question coming in from Vincent. What percentage at least of the budget comes from the income tax?
Well, the income, that's an interesting thing because it came up in this year's very early stage of this year's gubernatorial campaign. This time we're hearing Republican Betsy McCoy saying that she's going to phase that out. The income tax brings in approximately $12 billion. It's projected.
I'm laughing. I'm laughing because, hold it, somebody wants to get rid of the income tax. I've never heard that from a person running for governor before. That sounds so shocking.
I'm just going to give you the math. Next fiscal year, the income tax will support approximately 53% of the general fund. Okay, you could not meet all of your legal obligations to paying off debt service, contribute to the pensions, contribute to retiree health care, run Medicaid in compliance with federal law, and also provide municipal aid.
So hold it, just so we can understand this, Keith. You're talking about if we got rid of that stream of funding, it's not that we'd be cutting out some sort of fancy entitlement programs or things that people have questions about or whatever, or earmarks, which we'll get to. But you're talking that we wouldn't be able to meet our basic legal obligations to fund the things that we have obligations to fund and pay for.
Right. And for two very quick reasons. One, because some folks will say, no, you don't understand. As soon as we get rid of the income tax, it's going to spur on massive economic growth, and all the other taxes are just going to start grabbing dollars and pouring them in like crazy. Okay, but you have to still have a vehicle to collect it, meaning if you don't like the income tax, you need something else capable of scooping up those dollars. The sales tax, which is our second largest revenue engine, doesn't grow commensurate with people getting richer. So that doesn't mean like, oh, well, if my sales tax goes up 10%, then that'll compensate for getting rid of the sales tax. I mean, the cigarette tax, I mean, I don't know if they think everybody's going to start smoking 20 packs of cigarettes a day. You could take every other tax out there and you would basically have to double its growth rate. I mean, double its current take, excuse me, which has never happened. It's never happened in state history. So it's simply not, I don't think it's feasible to do that. The other thing is folks say, well, it wasn't that long ago we didn't have an income tax. Could things have really changed that much since 1991? Here's the problem, and I'm sorry to turn it into history class. Connecticut has been taxing income since 1970. In 1970, Connecticut began with a tax on capital gains. Shortly thereafter, we added a tax on dividends, and we have a tax on interest, but it was largely on large amounts of interest earnings. In other words, Connecticut began taxing the income of high earning households in 1970, and it became a significant revenue stream from the state almost right away. We have been relying on income in one form. Yes, it was broadened by 1991 to include the paycheck withholding of everyone across the economic spectrum. And by the way, the wealthy that were paying as much as 7% on their capital gains and 13% on their dividends now started to pay a much lower rate when the state income tax covering it all was established. But where I'm going with this is Connecticut's been relying on income to balance its books now for over half a century. It's far more dug in than people realize. It's
Okay, so
just the
we've got
math.
yeah, yeah, we've got some great questions coming in. So Carla is talking about something that I talked with your colleague Mark Pazienko about a little bit. She says we've seen lots of articles about federal changes in policy and funding to Connecticut. Are there impacts to this year's budget related to those changes? Extra money to address rolling out new policies, backfilling some of the cuts that are coming from the federal government. I know that the governor and the legislature tried to solve some of this problem at the end of last year with a special session with some emergency funds. Just to answer Carla's question, how is the governor and how are lawmakers thinking about some of the problems that are coming downstream from Washington right now and how they might backfill?
Yep. That was a great question. They were all great. Can I call that one super great? That
You
was
can
really
you can guess as many,
well, Carla.
please, they're great questions, really.
Thank you very much. Um, at first glance, the biggest hits from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that President Trump signed in July will start hitting in the 2027-28 fiscal year. However, there are some very important things going on right now. Part of the problem is we still don't have great numbers on exactly how much Connecticut's going to lose because Congress has been struggling ever since then to actually adopt an appropriations bill, which would sort of implement all of this stuff. You know, we've been dealing with shutdown or shutdown threat, and it's been a big holdup. But here are some of the more immediate impacts. One, the SNAP program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. There are approximately 35,000 folks who are either have lost or are losing their benefits as we speak. It's not all due. Some of it is due to changes in work requirements. Others are due to other rule changes. We're talking, though, about many people who, at least a lot of legislators are convinced are unemployable. They could be suffering from mental illness or other problems. And there is a disagreement on whether or not the state should be taking up funding for that. Senator Kathy Austin is one of those leading the charge. She does want to do it. It would cost the state about $25 million a year. And I'm trying to do the math quickly in my head. But if we're talking about Connecticut having a $1.9 billion surplus, 1% of that surplus is 19 million. So we're talking a little more than 1% of our surplus we'd have to put back in year after year to pick up the funding for those folks. The other big one, though, much bigger even in terms of, I think, impact among lawmakers is the Affordable Care Act, the federal tax credits that have expired that helped folks purchase health insurance on the exchange, low and middle income households buying health insurance on our exchange. Connecticut households lost almost $300 million in assistance. The legislature and Governor Lamont took a portion of last fiscal year's surplus, about $500 million. They set it aside, and they were going to use that to try to blunt some of these cuts in the short term. So Governor Lamont agreed to take about about 115 million of that 500 million this winter to help to make up for some of those lost $300 million. So the families wouldn't get hit with quite as big of an increase. No decision has been made beyond that. Now, the legislature is still talking, though, about keeping this fungible pot of money in play for another year and a half. Actually, they've already passed something to do that. And so I think you'll see a lot of pressure this coming 12 months from now, or next November, excuse me, there'll be pressure on Governor Lamont to again tap into that pot of money. But we're still solving this problem 1 year at a time. At some point, the General Assembly will have to decide if Washington doesn't reverse itself, does Connecticut want to step up and on an ongoing basis help these families buy health insurance? I have heard from legislators from both parties that there is some support for that.
And so, and yeah, that would be another one of those potential ongoing
Right.
costs that we would need to build in over and above whatever sort of tax rebates or other things that we've already talked about, extending to people beyond 1 year. Okay.
But one last thing
Yeah.
quickly to keep in mind, about a year from now also, we will, unless Congress reverses itself, be looking at a Medicaid system where we've probably lost about $500 million in federal assistance. That's the rough estimate that we're seeing thrown around. And at some point, Connecticut's going to have to decide, does it want to take some of its surplus and prop up Medicaid? We already have a Medicaid system that pays providers such low rates that poor patients on Husky can't get doctors willing to take on more Medicaid patients. Our
And that's what the
Medicaid,
current, yeah, that's what the current funding structure, which has some dollars coming from the federal government.
there are fewer than 10 states who pay less to specialty providers than Connecticut does. We're not competing to treat the poor. We're not competing with wealthy states like New York or Hawaii or Maryland. We're competing with the West Virginias. We're competing with the Arkansas in terms of what we pay.
Okay, so a lot more things to get to. Let's talk about something else that was in the governor's budget plan, and this would be reforms to earmarks. This is something that I know that lawmakers have struggled with for years. There's probably a big backstory about how lawmakers and governors in the past have worked to solve this problem. Why is this coming up right now, Keith? And what exactly is the governor proposing?
The impetus for the most recent discussion about it is the controversy involving funds that were sent to the Blue Hills Civic Association in Bloomfield. But here's the bigger problem, and this has been an issue for decades. This has been an issue my entire career covering state finances going back to the early 90s. Legislative leaders have almost always sought to have pools of, I want to say, loosely defined money in the budget that they can assign purposes for, usually to support projects in their caucus members' home districts. They don't want to spell all of the purposes out when the budget's being adopted because they don't know necessarily yet how they're going to do it. Someone may come to the fiscal year starts in July. Someone may come to them in November and say, I need money for the senior center in my district. Here's the problem, though. Legislators don't run government on a day-to-day basis. That's the executive branch. Sorry to go schoolhouse rock on everyone, but the legislature writes the budget and then the governor and his departments run the government day to day. So what we have is we sort of have, I won't say totally informal, but a loosely structured agreement where a small amount of money is put aside, and then the executive branch agrees. I hate to say it's a gentleman's agreement, but it's not enforceable. It's just all done on the goodwill basis, on the honor system. That when the governor hears from, or when the executive branch hears from legislative leaders, we'd like some money put here, we'd like some money put there, that money's assigned. And I don't want to say people are just throwing checks out left and right, but it is not the same as a fully established grant program that has rules, that has a specific application process, that may have audit requirements, that follows up afterward to make sure was the money spent exactly how you said it was going to be spent. And every so often, these earmarks have backfired on the legislature, and it looks like money was not spent as it was intended. Just before it looks a little like I'm vilifying legislators, let's ask why they want these earmarks. Is it all just about political influence? Part of the problem is legislators often disagree with the governor on how much to spend. And if you're a legislator, particularly from a poor district, and you feel consistently the spend has underinvested in education or social services or healthcare while you're watching one generation cover all of the pension debt. You're saying, couldn't we go a little slower and do something else? You say, fine, I can't win that big battle, but can I carve out something for my district? The problem then is, though, Are you being careful how you're assigning the money? With that huge lead in, what the governor is now saying is, one, I want to cut back how much we spend on earmarks. Let's cut back in not all, most areas by about 20%. He still wants to leave a few select areas like housing alone. But let's also try to, instead of putting this money in sort of a more omnibus account, let's try to spell out a little more detail how it's going to be done. But that tension is going to be going back and forth because the problem is the details are not always ready when the fiscal year begins in July. And legislators are always going to want to have the flexibility to respond during the other 11 months of the year.
If I can just, at the risk of expanding this part of our conversation too long, it is kind of fascinating, though, Keith, that this would be a proposal that would come up at the start of a legislative session that is an election year. It feels as though the governor is in some ways saying, okay, I've got a budget that gives me a lever with a $200 rebate to individuals that it will make people feel like government's giving something back to them. But these same lawmakers who want to be able to go back to their districts during an election year and be like, hey, I've got something in this budget for you through an earmark. He seems to be sort of tamping that down. I can't imagine that there aren't some Democratic lawmakers who are sort of upset about that.
I think that's a fair statement. It is an election year, so there's always pressure to bring home more. Also, when you think about the fact that this is not a new problem. I mean, one thing that I think there's a certain amount of misunderstanding regarding the controversy involving Blue Hills and Senator Doug McCrory is the fact that earmarks have been around for decades. I was telling John before the presentation, I remember in 2002, the state auditors, that's a bipartisan office, telling the legislature, you're calling these grants, but they really aren't grants. Grants have rules. And the legislature's response was, well, auditors, you work for us. Thank you for sharing, but we're going to keep going with this system. And I'll just give you one other example. When Governor Rell came into office in 2005, and she came in on the heels of a controversy that left her running mate, John Rowland, in jail in a controversy. Governor Rell would not use these earmarks. She would not use these loosely defined funds. And there were legislators who said, oh, yes, you are. And we're going to adopt the budget and we're going to put money in these line items. And she said, well, you can put all the money in the line items you want, but I won't be letting you touch it once the fiscal year begins, because she did not feel comfortable with this kind of a system.
Let's talk about something else that's been going on in Connecticut for a while, sort of a battle between state government and the state's hospitals. What exactly would the governor's budget do in order to address some of these questions, these concerns that are coming from the hospitals in the state?
Sure. We have had since 2011 a particular tax on hospitals. That's not when we began taxing them, but when we had a particular tax, this provider tax, which was always supposed to be a tax in name only. We were going to tax the industry, turn around and give the industry back more money than it gave us. And the whole point of this back and forth arrangement was it was a tool to get more money from Washington. The money the industry paid us was just a tax payment, but the minute the state touched it and handed it back, it was part of our Medicaid program. And then Washington had to help and kick money into Connecticut. And if for those who say that sounds like a gimmick or a racket, almost every state in the country has one like that. It was a tool that Washington set up to move Medicaid dollars into states. Unfortunately, it went off the rails pretty quickly. Connecticut started taxing more and more from hospitals and giving back less and less. The industry sued. Governor Lamont inherited that mess when he came in 2019. He settled the lawsuit and he agreed with the industry at the time on how we were going to do things. That agreement has since expired, and we were supposed to adjust the tax. Originally, the legislature was going to ask hospitals to give another $375 million. And Governor Lamont says, I want to scale that back to 100. Plus, I'm going to increase what we pay back to the industry by 140. So That will move this whole thing 40 to the better for the industry. The problem is, don't assume everything was nice and balanced. Even though Governor Lamont settled the lawsuit, the industry was still taking hits. We've never gotten it back to a point where the industry is actually held harmless. And they're saying, especially when you consider all the financial strains that COVID put on the hospitals, this needs much more of an overhaul, that we have to look at everything, or you're going to have more hospitals falling into financial distress. So while he scaled back what they planned quite a bit, the industry is saying it's still not enough. We are watching our fiscal health decline rapidly.
So let's talk about another institution in the state that has been saying we've been seeing our fiscal health declining rapidly. Michael has a question. Does higher education have any chance to convince the Appropriations Committee to go above the governor's recommended funding levels? And I think it's a fair question. What exactly does this budget do for higher ed?
To a large extent, this budget mostly treads water, and in a few places it goes down marginally. Here's the problem, though. That does not meet higher ed's ask. Higher ed, both the CSCU system and the University of Connecticut, were looking for more money just to meet current needs. Here's the problem. Higher ed had a real black eye last year when reports came out that the Connecticut State College and University system had amassed over $600 million in reserves. That was basically equal to half their budget. They were sitting on way too much money while they were still asking for some. So they are being forced to spend that down. Now, the University of Connecticut had healthy reserves, but much smaller than theirs. But right now, they're all in sort of the same boat. So last year, they didn't really get that much help, and they were told, start dipping into using up the one-time money you have in the bank. I think to a large extent, especially with CSCU, that's going to be the message again this year. I think UConn is going to try to separate itself a little more, saying, hey, we weren't sitting on that much cash.
What about K through 12 education? Is that sort of treading water in the budget as well?
For the most part, but keep in mind, we're already on a schedule to increase the education cost sharing grant. That's the state's largest operating grant for K-12 K through 12 education, excuse me. That said, ECS, as I pointed out, I mean, it has not been keeping pace with inflation for a long time. The Connecticut Conference of Municipalities actually, to show you how big a concern this was, they launched an ad campaign against Governor Lamont last March, saying he's not doing enough to deal with this problem. When you take on the governor with an ad campaign, you figure you have nothing to lose. You're taking too many hits. I think you're already seeing legislators from both parties saying, even with our plan to modestly ramp up the education cost sharing grants, we have to do more in that area. And the legislature, I should point out, did over the last year begin to increase special education grants, and Governor Lamont maintains those increases in his proposal.
Elsa from Norwalk is asking, says Norwalk has gotten the short end of the stick on education cost sharing funding for many years. Is there hope for the state to make ECS more equitable for a city like Norwalk, where some property owners are in higher brackets, but a great many families with children in school live in poverty?
Here's the problem. If you make a decision as a state that one generation is going to solve a pension problem created by 3 generations, the math simply doesn't add up. Let me just give you 3 numbers, and this will kind of show you an idea. When Governor Rell was finishing up her one full term, just before the Great Recession hit in 2008, about 6% of the budget's general fund was going for those mandatory pension contributions. Governor Malloy came in and he realized that he was inheriting a pension contribution system that had loopholes baked in that allowed the state to pay less than it should have. He tore those up and he committed the state in writing to paying the full required amount. Again, there's a minimum required amount. We had found ways to get around it before he was in office. He closed that. So 6% almost overnight goes to 11 to 12%. And that was the big reason why Governor Malloy was facing problems like that in the economy were causing the tax hikes, were causing, in some cases, a lot of jobs lost to attrition. Now, if you say, how are things going under Governor Lamont? Well, now you have to look at the fact that we're not only making our required contributions, but we're also taking a big chunk of change. We're calling it surplus, but we're forcing that surplus. We're grabbing money out of the budget, taking it away from other essentials. So we make our required payment. Then at the end of the year, we make that secondary payment. When you total all that up, about 21% of the budget, one out of every $5, is going toward a pension problem that not that long ago, only 6% of the budget was going toward. When you take one out of every $5 and say, we're going to pay down pension debt super fast compared to past efforts, but it's still going to be going into the 2040s. I think it's a pace that's just mathematically, it's going to be so hard to sustain. And that's why we're seeing the governor wants to do a rebate while he's running for reelection. He can't do it mathematically without cracking open that piggy bank that he's shooed everyone else away from and taking it away from the pension debt reduction efforts. Sorry for the long answer.
No, that's okay. I mean, a question coming in from David is David says property taxes are our most regressive taxes and are high because they're the major funding source for K through 12 public education. Any increase in state funding of this education, David says, should ease the property tax burden for individuals and local businesses. What relief is being proposed? David's getting in the heart of something, which is, if we do put more money into K through 12 education, somehow or other, those other taxes that I'm paying at the town and city level should come down as some sort of relief.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, there's a very, very small, modest increase in the education cost sharing grant. That's about it. And it's basically see the previous answer. As long as we're paying off pension debt at this hellacious pace, everything else basically is suffering. If you think of that increase from 6% to 12% to 21% of the budget, that money came from other programs. It didn't come from, like booming prosperity. I'm not saying Connecticut's economy's in the tank, but it came from other programs. So we shifted priorities. It's not that we couldn't ever go higher, but the question is, did we overcompensate? And it's very politically risky to say that you want to tamper with state budget caps, but just about everybody is trying to find one way or another, directly or indirectly, to move money around those budget caps. And that includes people in the past who always supported them, like Governor Lamont, like the Senate Republicans. They're not violating them, but they're finding ways to move around them and pay down pension debt less aggressively.
We just have a couple minutes left, Keith. I mean, what about some of the expenditures that are coming out in this budget for things like universal free breakfast or things having to do with early childhood education? I mean, there are some proposals here that are getting at some of the problems that less affluent members of Connecticut community are facing.
Mm-hmm. Universal free breakfast. The governor brought that proposal back. The legislature didn't like it last year. He asked again for $12 million to fund that. I do think there's more interest in the legislature for free lunch and trying to broaden that. But I'm not saying there's no chance for the universal free breakfast. The governor did include funds to study creating a public option. Now, it doesn't create it, to study creating a public option to try to expand health insurance offerings for folks who are not able to get the assistance they need on the exchange. I don't know if the legislature is going to be comfortable with just that step, but that money's out there. I do also just want to mention the transportation system could lead to quite a debate this year because the administration tipped its hands. It actually wants to scale back over the rest of this decade the amount of money we borrow every year. We're borrowing about $1.3 billion this year to fund upgrades to highways, bridges, rail lines. We pair that with federal grants. Those are the two things that pay for the transportation infrastructure work. That borrowing gets paid off by the budget special transportation fund. That's what receives all the gasoline taxes and a portion of the sales tax. The governor's plan calls for that borrowing to start within the next couple of years, start going down, and it'll be about 1.1 billion by the end of the decade. I think it's because they are finding the fuel taxes don't grow. The governor, if you remember, in his first term, tried to convince lawmakers to adopt tolls. That did not fly. I can't imagine he's going to go back to that before the next election. And I'm not saying I have any reason to believe he's coming back with it after. But we're reaching a point where if we don't want to find more revenue for transportation, we're starting to reach a limit on what we can do.
This is something when we started our conversation, talking an awful lot about Connecticut's debts and how quickly it should pay off debts, which debts it should prioritize. You talked about bond and debt a little bit in there, Keith, and this is something you and I have talked about for years too, is taking on debt for transportation projects sometimes is the only way to solve the problem that you have right in front of you, which is crumbling infrastructure. So talk a little bit more about that if you would, because it does seem like an interesting time to be saying, well, maybe not let's borrow so much for transportation when there are needs out there.
Obviously, the construction industry is going to have its own take on this. And certainly they say there are a few better economic multipliers than putting more money into transportation construction. I wish I could remember the specifics though, but Governor Malloy in his second term had commissioned a study on how much Connecticut's aging congested system costs businesses and costs the economy, that it's a huge drain. The problem is it's not a quick, easy fix, and it takes a long-term funding commitment. Governor Lamont really did try to convince folks to adopt tolls early in his first term. That did not go well. I don't see anything changing right now, but what concerns me is you don't when you see a plan to ultimately start scaling back the borrowing, that doesn't see any other sort of other solutions coming. That doesn't mean that you're going to see the transportation program abruptly change, but it's sort of it's slowing things down.
We have about a minute left, Keith, and so I'll end with a couple of big existential questions that I will ask you to answer in about 30 seconds. How's that?
Okay.
For pressure. The first one comes from Jan, who says, how do you expect the legislature to deal with the frightening expectation that approximately 50% of seniors will need nursing home or assisted living care? This idea that this is a big looming problem, another big looming problem that Connecticut needs to find a way to solve and fund.
Great question. I wish I had more time. Unfortunately, all I can do is scare you a little more. We have been
good.
Depriving the nursing home industry of inflationary increases, common theme, you've heard it, for probably more than 10 years now. At some point, that's going to have to change. And you said you had one more?
Yeah, and Dana is asking, how about climate change planning in terms of saving for potential floods or hurricane disasters? This is something that comes up every year. We see bigger and more awful storms all the time. How is the governor, how is the legislature thinking about spending money to actually prepare for these things?
I hate to end on a stumper. I don't know the answer to that question, but if Dana wants a good chance to remind people to email me, if Dana wants to email me that question, I will make sure I answer it. I'm sorry, I do not know.
Well, okay, so this is a good place to end. So you will answer people's questions if they want to get in touch with you. Your email address is in the chat right now.
Yep.
It's very easy to do, and you'll take people's questions over the course of the next couple of days and try to get back to them with as much information as possible.
Sure, if it would help to put in the subject line, CT Mirror Forum or something like that. Don't worry if you don't remember that, but anything to make it stand out would help me.
Excellent. Sounds good. Keith Phaneuf, it's always great fun to talk with you about these big, gnarly issues at the state capitol. Thanks again for doing this with us.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks also to the generous financial supporters of Connecticut Mirror's event series, our presenting sponsor, Eversource, amplifying sponsor, CBIA, and Mohegan Tribe, publishing sponsor, CLA, Express Strategies, Hinckley Allen, Rothar Law, LLC, and the Causeway Agency. A big special thanks to Connecticut Mirror's Celia Klotzer for producing this event and our entire events series. The next of these is actually coming up soon. Connecticut Mirror's community engagement reporter, Reggie David, is hosting a community listening session at the Burroughs Community Center in Bridgeport, Wednesday, February 25th from 6 to 7 p.m. please visit ctmirror.org/events for more information. While you're on that website, please do make a contribution to support the type of work that Reggie does, that Keith does, that all of their colleagues do each and every day to keep you informed about what's happening in the state of Connecticut. I'm John Dankosky. Thanks so much for joining us. Please have a good night.